The cart lurched over frozen ruts, and Helena Murphy tightened both arms around the basket of lilies, as if the flowers were a child and not a burden bought with someone else's money. Dawn had not yet broken cleanly over Bath. The sky held a flat iron colour. Sleet moved sideways under the wind and stung her cheeks until the skin went numb and then burned. Her gloves had soaked through before she reached Milsom Street. Thin kid leather turned dark and useless, and her fingertips throbbed where Lie had split them at the seams 2 nights earlier. She had wrapped those fingers in strips torn from an old hem and stitched until midnight by a single candle, wiring stems, trimming bruised petals, tying white satin into loops that would look effortless in a bright nave. Nothing about them was effortless. The wire had cut her thumb. The thread had bitten under her nail. Her stomach cramped in narrow waves because she had been given tea and no bread before being sent out. Men unloading casks glanced at her and then at the flowers and looked away in that quick, practised manner reserved for women who carried beauty they would never be allowed to own. 2 ladies in a closed carriage passed, warm behind glass, one of them lifting a lorgnette for a heartbeat, not to admire the lilies, but to place Helena properly in the world. Too thin, too pale, mantle too coarse, cart too open, no maid at her shoulder, therefore not a daughter, not a guest, not equal to notice. The horse tossed its head. Cold water from the cart rail ran down the inside of her sleeve. She shifted the basket again. The stems pressed into her forearm, damp and rigid. She told herself to hold them higher so the blossoms would not bruise. She told herself not to cough because each cough made her chest ache and made the driver turn with irritation, as if illness were insolence. By the time the church bell sounded the first quarter, her knees were shaking from cold and from balancing against each jolt, and white pollen had marked her skirt where one lily had broken open too early, a soft stain like chalk against morning grey. St. Cyprian's rose out of the mist with wet stone walls and black railings slick with rain. Its steps crowded already with footmen stamping their boots, and tradesmen carrying crates for the breakfast table that would follow the vows. Helena climbed down with care, boots slipping once on the cobble, and caught herself against the cart wheel before the basket tipped. No one offered a hand. A young footman in Harbury livery took one glance at her and said, "Late?" though she was not, and then reached for the flowers with both gloves clean and dry. She drew the basket back without thinking, because she had spent 3 nights making certain each stem sat precisely where Clara had demanded, because she knew which blooms would shed if tilted, because surrendering work done by her own hands always felt like surrendering proof that she could still do anything right. Inside, the vestibule smelled of wet wool, beeswax, and rosewater. Mrs. Harbury's scent travelled first, then the woman herself in dove-coloured silk that whispered with each movement as though fabric were applauding her. Clara stood before the mirror in cream satin and seed pearls, chin lifted, one hand poised at her waist so the sleeve would fall correctly. She was pretty in the exact way people forgave. Fair curls, bright mouth, easy laugh when she chose to use it. She did not look at Helena when she said, "Do not drip on me." Mrs. Harbury did look, and her eyes moved down Helena's mantle, over the damp hem, to the red cracks around her knuckles, with a quick curl of distaste that never needed raised volume to wound. Yet she raised her voice anyway, because patrons were arriving and witnesses mattered more than kindness ever had. "Stand behind your sister, straight. You are plain, but at least be useful. Hold the bouquet level. You are fortunate to be fed in this house at all." 2 women in feathered bonnets paused by the inner door and pretended not to listen. A verger carrying prayer books slowed. Even the boy with coal on his cuff stopped to watch. Humiliation required an audience to become complete. Helena moved where she was told. She stood where furniture stood. She held the lilies as if her wrists were made of wood. Her shoulders were tight with cold and with the effort of stillness. Rosewater settled on the back of her throat and made her think of locked cupboards, silver covers, and the small heel of yesterday's loaf she had eaten, standing by the scullery sink after midnight. People who had known her father did not always recognize her at first now, and when they did, their faces arranged themselves into pity disguised as politeness. Mr. Westcott, once a clerk in his chambers, inclined his head and said, "Miss Murphy," with an old softness that almost undid her, because no one in that building used her name unless they needed labour. Then Mrs. Harbury turned, and he remembered himself, stepping aside as though proximity might cost him invitation to supper. Helena kept her eyes on the white heads of the lilies and counted breaths to steady the tremor in her hands. Inhale for 4, hold for 2, release slowly. Her father had taught her that in the year before he died, when debts came in stacks and men with polished boots waited too long in the hall. He had been a solicitor with careful script and a reputation for precision until wartime speculation hollowed out clients and then consumed him with them. There had been papers he signed when fever had him and ink blurred at the edges. There had been assurances from men who smiled too readily. There had been a second marriage after her mother's death that brought Mrs. Harbury into their house with trunks of silk and promises of order. And then came rations measured by contempt, keys turned in pantry locks, and quiet revisions to accounts that placed obligations under Helena's name while Clara's lessons in music and French continued untouched. The dowry that should have been split was spoken of as if it had only ever belonged to one daughter. Helena received the attic truckle bed, one dress mended until the seams were mostly thread, and the narrow mercy of invisibility. She made herself small to survive. She learned to move without sound on stairboards that complained under weight. She learned which servants might pass a crust wrapped in cloth and which would report even gratitude as insolence. She kept one private act against erasure. A notebook hidden beneath the mattress, legal shorthand in her father's hand, copied into her own, symbols and abbreviations no one in that house could read. On nights when wind came through the attic eaves and hunger made her dizzy, she traced those marks by candlelight and remembered that once she had been taught as an heir to thought, not merely as a pair of hands. Now she stood in church silk shadows with raw fingers and held flowers for the sister who had inherited her place. The bells began to peal in earnest. Their sound struck stone and bone together. Guests shifted toward the nave. Clara adjusted her veil and asked for pins, then dropped one on purpose so Helena would have to kneel and retrieve it with occupied hands. By the time Helena rose again, her lower back had seized from the cold and the basket weight. Mrs. Harbury moved through pews, greeting names with practised warmth, and in each conversation she inserted Helena like a cautionary tale. "My late husband's daughter," she said once, with a sigh that made widowhood sound decorative. "Dutiful, but not suited to company." A second time, "We keep her close to useful tasks. She has no head for society." A third, "Plain girls must cultivate obedience." Every sentence was pitched so nearby, listeners could not pretend they had misheard. Every sentence took something and left no mark visible enough for complaint. Helena felt the old sensations cue in her body one by one, heat in her face despite the cold hollowness under the ribs, a thin pulse at her throat that made swallowing difficult. She could not set down the flowers. She could not wipe the sleet from her lashes. She could not straighten her right shoulder where Mrs. Harbury had gripped her the night before. and left finger-shaped bruises that bloomed now beneath wool and skin. The vestibule door opened and shut. Damp air entered in breaths. The organist touched tentative chords that failed and began again. Somewhere close, a child laughed and was hushed at once. Helena watched water drip from her mantle to the stone in small dark coins. She thought of the attic basin with ice skimming the top each morning. She thought of hemseams, of needles, of the smell of scorched starch when she ironed Clara's sleeves after everyone else slept. She thought of the box in the back of her father's cupboard, tied with a faded cord, the only object Mrs. Harbury had not yet thrown out because it remained inconveniently locked. She had asked for it once, quietly. She had been told that daughters with no dowry did not inherit keepsakes. She had asked a second time and gone without supper for 2 days. Around her, satin-brushed pew wood. Gloves were removed, rings flashed under candlelight, and voices settled into the soft confidence of people whose futures were not negotiated by threat. When the verger came to say the rector was ready, Mrs. Harbury did not call for Helena in public again. She waited until the vestibule thinned, then beckoned with 2 fingers toward the narrow vestry corridor, where coats hung and damp stone held the chill like a vault. The door shut behind them with a blunt final sound. Rosewater filled the small space, cloying and sharp. Mrs. Harbury seized Helena's wrist, exactly where yesterday's bruise lay deepest, and pressed hard enough that Helena's hand opened and nearly dropped the bouquet. Pain shot up her forearm, and she bit the inside of her cheek to keep silence from breaking into a cry. "Listen to me," Mrs. Harbury said, each word crisp as folded linen. "You will smile when spoken to. You will hold those flowers without trembling. You will remain silent through the vows. If you disgrace this family, if you so much as glance toward the groom with that mournful face, I shall have your father's final box burned before supper." Helena stared at the pale hand crushing her wrist, at the pearl bracelet resting above it, at the neat cuff that would never smell of lye. For one instant, anger rose so clean she could taste metal. Then it passed beneath the harder discipline of survival. She lifted her chin by a fraction and answered in the tone she had taught herself to use, the tone that gave nothing away. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Harbury released her with a small push that sent her shoulder into the wall. The stone took the impact. The lilies swayed, and one petal fell, white against black flagging. Helena bent, retrieved it, and set it back among the stems, with fingers that would not stop shaking. Outside, the bell called again, louder now. She stepped into the corridor light and resumed her place behind her sister. Bouquet raised, spine straight, hunger quiet, face still. She stood where Mrs. Harbury had placed her, half a step behind Clara's right shoulder, the bouquet balanced at the level of her sister's waist, and the church seemed to narrow around that one arrangement, as if the building itself agreed Helena had no other function. Candle heat reached her in faint breaths that did not touch her hands. Wax and whetstone and rosewater layered in the air until each inhale tasted of someone else's comfort. The organist found the proper key at last, a low, solemn line that moved through the vestibule and into her chest like a hand pressing flat against bruised skin. Clara tilted her head when the first notes began and murmured to no one in particular, "Do not stand so near. Your mantle smells of rain." Helena shifted back exactly 1 inch, though there was nowhere to go but the door and the draught under it. The motion pulled at the bruise on her wrist, and the pain carried her backward in memory with such force that the present blurred for a heartbeat. There had been another hallway, warmer years ago, before the carpets were sold and before pantry locks appeared. Her father had stood at a walnut table with his sleeves rolled, spectacles low on his nose, showing her how to shorten a phrase into marks no eavesdropper could read. estate into sigil, obligation into stroke and loop. "Precision is kindness," he had told her, tapping the page while evening rain hit the windows. "If words are exact, they do less harm." He had still believed harm could be managed by diligence then. Men came later, with polished boots and sympathetic voices, speaking of opportunities tied to military contracts and shipping ventures in terms so smooth they slid past caution. He had signed at speed in those final months, feverish and ashamed, while creditors waited downstairs with hats in hand and impatience in their eyes. Helena remembered carrying tea that went cold untouched. She remembered seeing his signature waver once, then steady as pride forced his hand level. After he died, Mrs. Harbury gathered papers into neat stacks and called it a sus order. By winter, debts she had never incurred appeared beside Helena's name in ledgers she was not permitted to inspect. By spring, the silver had gone. By summer, invitations came only for Clara. "Circumstances require discipline," Mrs. Harbury had said the first night she measured bread by weight and gave Helena half the portion. "A plain girl must earn her keep." She had said it at the dining table in front of 2 guests, who nodded as if economy and cruelty were close relations. The memory sat under Helena's ribs now, sharp as wire, while Clara accepted admiration for the lace at her throat that Helena had mended by candlelight after mice chewed the edge in storage. A footman opened the inner door. Sound from the nave swelled and settled. Helena could see only a slice of it from where she stood, black coats and pale gloves and the gleam of polished pews. Yet she knew where each family would be seated because her father had once named them for her as they passed in the pump room, not to flatter rank but to teach her who held power over leases, over courts, over mercy. Mr. Latham near the front, who had laughed too loudly when the Murphy accounts failed. Lady Pennicott 2 rows behind, who sent flowers for funerals but never for recoveries. The rector waiting in white linen with hands folded, looking grave enough to pass for justice. Helena swallowed against the dryness in her throat. She had not been thirsty until that instant. She was always thirsty during ceremonies, as if the body understood that silence cost water. Clara leaned back without turning her head. "Hold the stems higher. They droop." The command was soft, practiced, almost affectionate to an untrained ear. Helena lifted the bouquet and felt a fresh split open at the base of her forefinger, where wet ribbon rubbed against old cuts. When she was 16, before hunger hollowed her face into angles strangers called severe, she had asked Mrs. Harbury for new gloves for Michaelmas service because hers had worn through at the palms. Mrs. Harbury had smiled and said, "You may have gloves when your posture is worthy of being observed." Clara had laughed then, bright and careless, and offered her own discarded pair with one finger torn open. Helena had thanked her because gratitude had become a currency she was compelled to pay, and she had stitched that finger closed with thread pulled from a hem. She stitched everything. She stitched cuffs, ribbons, hems, appearances, and she stitched her own mouth shut each time Clara spoke of her, in third person, while she stood in the room. "She will not need a fire," Clara had said one January evening when coal was short. "She is accustomed to the attic cold. She reads too much for a girl with no prospects." On another, while Helena poured tea she was not allowed to drink, "Take away her candle at 11. That had been the year Mrs. Harbury found a page of shorthand by the wash-basin and demanded to know which man had written to her. Helena had answered, "No man, ma'am, my father taught me." The slap came quick, more insult than force, but it stung long after because Clara watched and turned her gaze to the mirror rather than intervene. Later, in the dark, Helena had copied the same symbols again from memory, so she would not lose them. She had hidden the notebook under the mattress, then under a loose board when mice nested in the straw, then finally inside the lining of her mantle when Mrs. Harbury began searching her room before supper. The weight of that hidden knowledge rested now between her shoulder blades like a second spine, straightening her even while shame tried to fold her in half. Mrs. Harbury returned from the nave with approval arranged on her face, one hand gliding over Clara's sleeve, checking every fold as if inspecting an investment. "You will remember your smile," she said to Helena without looking directly at her. "People forgive poverty if it is quiet." Her silk brushed Helena's damp skirt and recoiled, and the woman's nostrils flared at the contact. "And keep your eyes lowered. No one wishes to be stared at by servants." The word struck with deliberate inaccuracy, and that was always the method. Not denial of facts. Reclassification. Daughter became burden. Heir became dependent. Memory became ingratitude. When Helena was 17, and the final decent room on the second floor was given to Clara's pianoforte, Mrs. Harbury had stood in the doorway with a ring of keys at her waist and said, "You are sensible. You will prefer the attic. It will teach you humility." She had carried the truckle bed herself up 2 flights because no footman would risk rebuke by helping without permission. At the landing she had paused, dizzy from effort, and old Mrs. Davies from the kitchens had met her eyes, then slipped half a heel of bread into her apron pocket as she passed. No words. Kindness had to travel in silence in that house or be confiscated. Helena had eaten the bread in 4 measured bites and cried only once, quickly, because tears made hunger worse. The next morning, Mrs. Harbury announced that Helena's father had left complex liabilities, that Clara's dowry was therefore sacrosanct, and that Helena's maintenance would be deducted against a list of household expenses written in a clerk's hand she did not recognise. Soap, candles, thread, doctor's fee for an illness she had tended herself, interest upon interest, line after line, until obligation grew faster than labour could repay it. She had asked carefully, "May I review the accounts, ma'am?" Mrs. Harbury had smiled that hard little smile and answered, "You may review your conduct." Today that same smile waited at the edge of her mouth while she adjusted Clara's veil and whispered, loud enough for Helena and 2 nearby guests to hear, "One daughter brings honour, the other requires management." Clara made a sound like restrained amusement. Helena felt heat rise under her collar, then ebb. She kept the bouquet level. She kept her breathing even. The injustice had been repeated too many times to surprise. Repetition had turned it from wound to weather, constant and cold, and requiring daily adaptation. Yet weather wore stone. She knew that also. She had watched the church steps lose their sharp corners year by year under rain and feet and time, and she held that thought now as if it were a coal she could warm her hands above without anyone seeing. The verger lifted his hand. The processional would begin on the next phrase from the organ, and the whole machine of rank and fabric and spoken promises would move forward whether Helena's knees steadied or not. She fixed her gaze on the white lilies until each petal edge came clear. She had chosen those lilies because her father once said they carried both mourning and oath in their shape, and she had wondered if anyone in this church would understand the insult of placing them in Clara's hands. He would have understood. He had noticed symbols where others noticed only decoration. He had noticed her too, which had not saved him, and had not saved her, but had left her with a discipline no one had yet managed to starve out of her. The final weeks of his life returned in fragments timed to the organ's beat, his cough under the study door, ink on his thumb, a tremor in his right hand when he lifted a cup the day he pressed a small brass key into her palm and said, voice thread, thin, "If they tell you there's nothing left, verify." She had lost the key when Mrs. Harbury emptied his desk, or Mrs. Harbury had taken it. She had never been able to prove which. She only knew the box remained locked in the back cupboard, the one object spared from sale because its contents were unknown, and unknown things unsettled Mrs. Harbury more than open contempt. That box had become a quiet centre around which Helena arranged endurance. Endure breakfast without bread, and there might be a chance to open it. Endure winter without coal, and there might be a chance. Endure public correction, private threats, Clara's polished indifference, the servant's careful pity, the small derisions folded into every instruction. And there might be one evening when keys changed hands, and a lock yielded, and facts replaced story. "Walk when I walk," Clara said, extending her fingers backward without turning. Helena placed the bouquet into that waiting grasp, and for a fleeting moment their hands touched, warm satin against cold skin, privilege against labour, two lives bound by the same dead man and divided by every living choice that followed. Mrs. Harbury stepped to the side, triumphant in her arrangement of bodies, and nodded once toward the nave. Helena lowered her eyes as ordered. She did not bow her head. The organ rose. The doors opened wider. She moved after her sister into the light. She moved after her sister into the light, and every face in the nave turned toward Clara, as if the white satin itself had summoned them. Helena walked one measured pace behind, hands empty now, her palms marked with damp from the stems she had held too long. Candles climbed the aisle in double rows, their flames narrow and unwavering despite the wind pressing at the high windows. Lord Ashcombe waited at the chancel rail, tall and fair and composed in dark formal coat, his cravat tied with military exactness, his expression settled into the bland gravity expected of a bridegroom before witnesses. He did not look toward Helena. Men like him rarely looked twice at women placed behind flowers and veils. The first rupture came from the side door with a blunt crack of wood against stone. A gust of sleet drove in with it. Heads turned sharply. A man in courier livery stumbled across the threshold, hat gone, hair plastered to his brow, rain running from his sleeves to the flagging in quick silver lines. He held one hand against his ribs, as if he had ridden hard and fallen once already. In his other hand he lifted a sealed letter above shoulder height so it would not be lost in the crush. "Miss Helena Murphy," he called, voice rough with cold and urgency, "from Mr. Pike, into her hand by instruction." The name struck her like a bell under water. Pike, her father's old clerk, the one man who had once corrected her shorthand without condescension. She took a step without permission. Mrs. Harbury moved faster. Silk hissed. Her gloved fingers closed over Helena's sleeve and yanked her back into line hard enough to jolt her shoulder. "You forget yourself," she said, through a smile fixed for the congregation. Then, louder to the verger nearest the door, "Remove that man! He is drunk or deranged!" The messenger swore he was sober, swore again that he had orders, held up the seal stamped in dark wax. Helena saw the crest for one instant between bodies, a small pikefish over crossed quills, the old office mark her father used before his practice was dissolved. Her breath caught so sharply it hurt. She knew that seal. She had pressed it herself on winter afternoons, while ink dried by the hearth. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mrs. Harbury's nails bit through wool at her arm, a warning as clear as any blade. The second rupture followed on the first so quickly the two seemed one wound in time. A startled footman shoved the side door closed against the weather, and the heavy panel struck a brass stand set too near the aisle. The stand lurched, a candelabrum tipped and shattered against the edge of the rail, metal twisting, wax and flame dropping. Lord Ashcombe reached by instinct to steady it before it fell into Clara's skirts. Glass from the broken cup sliced across his palm. He did not cry out. He hissed once between his teeth and caught the stand anyway, but blood welled dark and immediate, running over his cuff, then down onto the white linen runner in fat, spreading drops that looked almost black in candlelight. Clara gave a small, strangled sound and stepped back. Guests rose halfway from pews. Someone shouted for a surgeon. No one moved toward him. Helena moved. She did not ask. She crossed the last yards of aisle, dropped to one knee on cold stone, and took Lord Ashcombe's injured hand before he could pull it away. Blood made his skin slick. The cut was clean, but deep enough to gape when his fingers flexed. "Hold still, my lord," she said, and her voice came steadier than she felt. There was no linen at hand, no bandage, no basin, only flowers, ribbon, and panic. She tore the trailing satin from Clara's bouquet where it had been pinned beneath the lilies, wrapped it once across his palm, pressed hard with both thumbs, and wound the length around his wrist and knuckles in tight, efficient passes her father had taught her for kitchen wounds and carriage accidents. Pressure first, elevation, keep him from clenching. Ashcombe stared down at her, as if just then discovering she existed. "Do not bind it so tightly," Clara snapped behind her, horrified at the ruined bouquet more than the blood. Helena did not look up. "If I do not, he will continue bleeding." The rector hovered, white-faced. A guest muttered about contamination of the altar cloth. Another about omens. Mrs. Harbury's grip found Helena's shoulder again, fingers digging into muscle. "Stand up this instant. You are not fit to touch him." A voice from the chancel shadows cut across every other sound. "Stand. Give me your hand, not his." The command was low and hard and carried farther than a shout. Helena lifted her head. A man had stepped from the north transept where the light was weaker, rain still dark on the shoulders of his greatcoat, as if he had only just come in from the storm. He was taller than Ashcombe by a clear inch, broader through chest and back, dark hair wet and pushed from a brow marked by a narrow white scar that vanished into his temple. His jaw looked carved from stone. His eyes were a winter grey that did not soften when they landed on her. Everyone in Bath knew that face, even if they knew it only from distance in carriage windows and courtroom galleries. Duke Sebastian Vale. The stillness that followed his appearance felt heavier than noise. Even the child who had been whispering in the second pew went quiet. Ashcombe exhaled through his nose, half relief, half irritation. "Brother, it is a scratch." Vale did not answer him. His gaze remained on Helena's hands, on the red seeping through white satin, on the way her fingers trembled only after she tied the final knot. She rose because he had ordered it, knees stiff from stone and cold. She held out Ashcombe's hand, as if passing evidence in a court, not daring to blot the blood on her skirt, though it had already marked her cuffs. Vale took Ashcombe's wrist, assessed the bind with one glance, and nodded once, a motion so slight she might have imagined it. Then he turned Helena's left hand over without asking. His grip was controlled, not gentle, not cruel, simply certain. The wet glove had split at the seam. Beneath it her knuckles were cracked and inflamed, and along the inside of her wrist the old bruise had ripened into distinct finger marks, yellowing at the edges, purple at the centre. His eyes narrowed by a fraction. "You are injured," he said, as if reciting a fact that could not be disputed. "You will not faint here." "I do not faint, your grace." The words escaped before caution could blunt them. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Good." By the time the verger righted the fallen stand and a footman smothered the last candle flame with his glove, the organist had gone silent. Rain rattled at the side door in uneven bursts. The messenger was still there at the back, held between two servants, face flushed with cold and outrage. letter clenched in his fist like a relic. "Miss Murphy must receive this," he called again, hoarse now, "from Mr. Pike of Broad Street, her father's office, by law." Every eye that had not settled on the blood now shifted to Helena, then to Mrs. Harbury. Mrs. Harbury laughed lightly, too quickly. "A vulgar interruption. The man is mistaken. There is no business for my stepdaughter in a church." She extended her hand toward the letter with social confidence polished by long practice. "Give it here. I will examine it." The messenger hesitated. He looked at Helena directly. "Miss—" It was not deference, it was appeal. Helena could feel Vale beside her like a change in weather, cold and deliberate. She could feel Mrs. Harbury's expectation pressing from the other side, demanding compliance in front of half the county. She should have held silence. She should have lowered her eyes and let the letter pass. She heard her father's last clear instruction, as if he stood at her shoulder. "Verify," she lifted her chin. "The letter is addressed to me." Mrs. Harbury's nails dug into her elbow again, hidden by silk and angle. "You will remember where you stand." Vale turned his head toward Mrs. Harbury with a slowness more threatening than anger. "Release her!" The word dropped into the nave and altered the room. Mrs. Harbury released Helena at once. Colour climbed under her powder. "Your Grace, this is a family matter." "So I have observed." His tone did not rise. "Miss Murphy will take what is hers." The messenger crossed the aisle before anyone could intervene and placed the sealed letter in Helena's stained hand. The wax was damp but intact. Pike's marks stared up at her from the centre. Fish and quills pressed deep. Her pulse hammered against the paper. She wanted to break it then and there. She wanted a locked door and 5 quiet minutes, and her father's voice explaining each line. She had neither. Mrs. Harbury's gaze burned against her cheek. Clara stood rigid beside Ashcombe, bouquet half ruined, veil trembling at the edge where her breath caught too fast. Ashcombe flexed his uninjured hand and looked from Helena to the Duke with growing impatience. "Sebastian, if this spectacle is concluded, I intend to be married." Vale did not move for 2 breaths. Then he handed Ashcombe's bound wrist to the rector, as if transferring command. "Keep his hand elevated. Send for Mr. Greeley to stitch it after the vows." He looked at Helena again, and this time the scrutiny was precise enough to feel like touch. "Can you stand?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Then stand there." He indicated a place at the chancel step, not behind Clara, not with servants at the wall, but within sight of him and the altar both. It was another command disguised as arrangement. She obeyed because refusal would have fed Mrs. Harbury, and because her knees had not yet steadied enough for defiance with consequence. The organ resumed on a shaken chord and found its line on the second attempt. Guests settled by degrees, whispering behind gloves. The rector cleared his throat 3 times before speech returned to him. Clara stepped into position, chin high, smile repaired. Ashcombe offered his uninjured hand. Blood had dried in a dark seam along the satin ribbon Helena tied. The stain remained visible no matter how he angled it. During the first prayer, Helena kept the letter pressed flat against her palm inside her mantle, so the wax would not crack. She felt each syllable of the service pass like a weight being stacked. Covenant, honour, obedience, law. Mrs. Harbury watched her instead of the couple, eyes sharp with calculation and fear. When the vows began in earnest, Vale took his place 1 pace behind Ashcombe's shoulder. He did not remove his gloves. Rainwater still marked the hem of his coat. She felt his attention once, twice, like a blade of light crossing her skin, and each time she fixed her gaze on the open prayer book and did not look up. The room smelled of wet wool, candle smoke, crushed lilies, and iron from blood. Outside, the sleet had thickened to hard pellets against the glass. Inside, words were spoken that could not be recalled. At the final blessing, Clara's voice rang clear. Ashcombe's voice remained steady despite pain. They were pronounced husband and wife before all who mattered in Bath. Applause flickered and swelled, relieved, eager to erase disorder with ritual. Helena did not clap. She stood where the Duke had placed her, fingers closing around the damp letter until the edges bent, and knew with a certainty that settled deep as bone that the day had broken open and would not be mended by supper. Applause thinned into the rustle of coats and relieved conversation, and the congregation surged toward the aisle as though the blood on linen and the courier's shout had been no more than a draught under a door. Clara turned her new ring to catch candlelight. Lord Ashcombe bent his head to the nearest well-wisher, jaw tight where pain pulled at the corner of his mouth. The rector began speaking of breakfast arrangements. Footmen moved fast to replace the stained runner. Ritual had resumed its work of concealment. Helena stood where Duke Vale had placed her, the letter hidden in the fold of her mantle, wax seal pressing warm now against her palm. She kept her face still while guests passed. Twice she heard her own name, soft and curious, from women who had never spoken to her. Once she heard the stepdaughter, and then laughter quickly covered by a cough. Mrs. Harbury did not approach at once. She waited until enough bodies stood between Helena and the chancel, then arrived with silk and rosewater and a smile arranged for witnesses. "There you are," she said lightly. "You have done your little duty. Give me that letter." "It is addressed to me." Mrs. Harbury's smile did not move. "You will not provoke another scene." Her fingers closed over Helena's wrist in the same bruised place. Helena did not flinch, but the pain travelled to her shoulder in a clean, bright line. Around them, congratulations continued. No one looked directly at the two women pressed near the side pew, where shadow hid hands, but not posture. Mrs. Harbury leaned closer, voice low enough to pass for affection. "Do not force me to remind you what burns first when a fire is set in an attic." The threat struck her like sleet on bare skin. Her father's box, the cord around it, the lock that had outlasted every demand. She tried to draw back, and Mrs. Harbury's grip sharpened. "Give it!" Helena held the paper one heartbeat longer. It was all she could claim in that moment, one heartbeat of possession. Then she released it, because she had learned the arithmetic of survival in that house, and knew when resistance cost more than it preserved. Mrs. Harbury slid the letter into her reticule with one neat motion, and patted Helena's sleeve as though smoothing a crease. "Better," she said. "Now fetch your sister's travelling cloak, and do not stand near the family portraits when we return. Wet wool leaves a smell." By the time the church clock marked the half-hour, Clara and Lord Ashcombe were descending the west steps, beneath umbrellas held by men who never missed their cue. Clara did not look back. Ashcombe did once, brief and unreadable, his bandaged hand resting against his coat. Duke Vale followed at a distance, rain darkening his collar again. Helena carried the discarded lilies in a basket with torn ribbon tails and wax spots on 2 petals. They looked less like wedding flowers now and more like aftermath. At the carriage, Mrs. Harbury turned in full view of guests sheltering under the portico. "You will walk," she told Helena. "The cart is occupied. We have no room for draggled mantles and churchyard mud. Be useful when you arrive. Fires must be lit before we return from the breakfast table." The sleet had hardened. It tapped against stone like thrown seed. Helena shifted the basket and nodded because refusal in public always became punishment in private. "Mrs." Harbury lowered her voice for the final cut. "And do not imagine His Grace's interference changes your place." The door shut. Clara's veil moved behind glass. Wheels rolled. Hooves struck sparks from wet cobble, then faded down the lane with the rest of the wedding procession. Helena remained on the church steps with a basket of damaged lilies and no gloves left dry. She should have left at once. She knew the road home blind. Down Broad Street, past the pump, left where the bakery chimney leaned. 20 minutes in fair weather, longer in sleet with soaked boots. She descended the steps and crossed the churchyard, head bent against the wind, eyes burning from cold and lack of sleep. The bell tower began another peal for the departing bridal carriage, loud enough to shake water from the yew branches. She flinched at the first strike. On the third she heard another sound threaded beneath the bells. Not a cry. A harsh, thin pull of air that stopped too soon. She turned toward the old lich gate where ivy clung to black oak, and the ground dipped near the boundary wall. A small figure was crouched beside the stone trough, one hand braced on the rim, shoulders jerking with each attempted breath. A boy's hat lay in a puddle nearby. His coat was fine navy wool with silver buttons. His hair, dark and rain-plastered, clung to his forehead. He could not have been more than 8. Helena set down the basket and knelt in the mud. "Look at me," she said, keeping her voice low and steady. "Do not lie down. Stay upright." The boy tried to answer and could not. Panic widened his eyes until the grey seemed almost white. Each inhale whistled high at the throat and failed in his chest. He clawed at his cravat with shaking fingers. "Good," she said quickly, catching his hands so he would not tear the cloth tighter. "I will loosen it. You must let me." He gave one sharp nod. She untied the knot, opened the collar, and eased him forward so his elbows rested on the trough edge. Rain ran from the stone over his knuckles. His skin felt cold and slick. Bells thundered again from the tower, and he recoiled, breath breaking into faster, shallower pulls. "It is all right," she said, though nothing around them was gentle. "Listen to me, not to the bells. In through your nose if you can. Then out slowly, like cooling soup, longer out than in." Her father had taught her that on nights his lungs tightened after court days and chimney smoke sat low over Bath. Sit forward, open the ribs. Count for him when he couldn't count for himself. She had not used the method in years, only on herself, in quiet corners when fear locked her throat. Now she placed one hand lightly between the boy's shoulder blades and counted against the sleet. 1 in, 2 out, again. He failed twice and coughed hard enough to fold at the waist. She supported him, rubbing small circles through soaked cloth, waiting for the spasm to pass. No one else had reached them. The procession had carried everyone toward the front lane. The churchyard beyond the yews was briefly empty, only iron railings and tilted stones and weather. "You are not alone," she said. "Stay with me, 1 in, 2 out." His next exhale ran longer, the whistle softened by a fraction. She took off her mantle despite the cold and wrapped it around his shoulders, tucking the wool across his chest to trap what little warmth remained. Her dress sleeves were thin beneath. Wind cut through at once and raised a tremor from wrist to jaw. She ignored it. The boy's fingers latched onto her forearm, hard and desperate. "Hurts," he managed. "I know. Keep going." She counted again. 10 breaths. 15. At 20, his shoulders lowered a little between attempts. At 30, the sound in his throat changed from shrill to rough. He drew one breath deep enough to make him cough, and then another that held. Tears stood in his eyes from effort. He blinked them away with fierce concentration, as if weeping in front of a stranger were a separate battle he intended to win. "That is it," she whispered. "Brave lad! Again!" A boot scraped on wet gravel behind her. She did not turn. She had learned to finish care before answering authority. The boy's breathing steadied by degrees. Still laboured, no longer spiralling. Colour returned to his lips in faint increments. Helena loosened her supporting hand and let him hold the stone trough himself. "Can you tell me your name?" "Thomas," he said, voice frayed but clear enough. "Thomas. Good. I am Helena." His gaze shifted past her shoulder and fixed. The grip on her arm eased. "Papa." Helena looked up then. Duke Sebastian Vale stood 3 paces away beneath the lich gate, hat in one hand, rain running from his hair and coat, his face as still as carved slate. 2 grooms hovered farther back with a carriage lantern and did not speak. He had seen enough to understand the scene without explanation. Her mantle around his son, mud on her knees, the basket of wedding lilies abandoned in sleet, the boy breathing against her shoulder in counted intervals. Vale stepped forward and crouched beside Thomas, one gloved hand settling at the nape of the boy's neck. His voice, when he spoke to his son, was lower than Helena had heard in church. "Look at me." Thomas obeyed at once. "Breathe with me." They breathed together 3 times, father and son matched and deliberate. On the 4th, Thomas leaned into him, exhausted from effort. Vale's jaw tightened once, and she saw the scar at his temple pull white. He kept his gaze on the boy while speaking to her. "What did you do?" "Loosened his collar, sat him forward, lengthened the exhale." "Why did you know it?" "My father's chest would seize in winter." Vale nodded, accepting the answer as sufficient. He took off his greatcoat and wrapped it over Thomas and Helena's mantle both, sealing heat around the child with brisk precision. Only then did he look directly at her. His eyes moved from her bare, reddened hands to the soaked sleeve clinging to her bruised wrist, to the mud at her hem. "You gave him your only dry layer." "He needed it." A shadow of movement crossed the path. Mrs. Harbury appeared at the edge of the yews, skirts lifted from the mud, one maid panting behind her with a parasol angled uselessly against sideways sleet. She had likely come back in search of appearances or gossip, and found something she could not immediately classify. Her expression sharpened when she saw Helena kneeling close to the Duke's son. "Helena!" she snapped. "Stand away from that child at once. You are drenched and unfit to attend him. Your Grace, forgive this presumption. She has no training." Thomas turned his face into his father's coat and clutched tighter. Helena started to rise. Vale lifted one hand without looking at her. "Stay." The single word held her in place more surely than Mrs. Harbury's grip ever had. Mrs. Harbury smiled with visible effort. "You are kind, Your Grace, but my stepdaughter is required at home. There are tasks she has neglected already." Vale stood, Thomas in his arms now, the boy's head against his shoulder. Rain struck his uncovered hair and slid down the hard line of his cheek. He did not raise his voice. "She comes to Ravenscar tonight. My son breathes because of her." Mrs. Harbury gave a brittle laugh. Surely a household maid can be sent instead. Helena is not—" "She comes," he repeated, "with her own name, not as maid." Silence followed, broken only by sleet and Thomas's recovering breaths. Mrs. Harbury's colour faded under powder. She glanced once at Helena, and the look carried promise of later punishment, old habits reaching for ground already shifting beneath them. Helena pushed herself to standing, knees stiff, fingers numb. She could feel cold settling deep now that urgency had ebbed. Vale turned his attention back to her. "You will ride in my carriage," he said. "A physician waits at Ravenscar." "For Thomas," she answered. "For Thomas first." The distinction mattered. So did the fact that he made it aloud. She looked past him toward the lane where the Harbury carriage had vanished, then down at the lilies in the mud and the torn white ribbon darkened by Ashcombe's blood. The letter from Mr. Pike burned in memory like a brand. Not in her hand now. In Mrs. Harbury's reticule, her father's box still locked. If she rode to Ravenscar without securing either, Mrs. Harbury would have hours to destroy what remained. "I will come," she said, and her voice shook once from cold, then steadied. "But I must return first for my father's box." Vale studied her face as if measuring whether this was fear, stubbornness, or sense. "What box?" "The last of his papers, locked in a cupboard at Harbury House. If it is burned, truth is burned with it," Mrs. Harbury cut in quickly. "Delusion, old receipts, and mould." Vale did not look at her. "How long to fetch it?" 15 minutes if the key is where I left it, longer if it's hidden." "Then you will have 20. He shifted Thomas higher in his arms and spoke toward the grooms. "Take Miss Murphy to Harbury House. Wait at the door. If anyone obstructs her, send for me." One groom bowed and ran for the carriage. The other held the lantern higher, its light catching on wet stone and Helena's split knuckles. Mrs. Harbury stepped forward, silk brushing thorns. "Your Grace, this is most irregular." Vale's gaze moved to her at last, cold and exact. "Fraud is irregular. A woman taking back her father's papers is not." The word hung between them. Fraud, not accusation yet, but placement. Mrs. Harbury's lips parted and closed without reply. Helena bent to retrieve the basket of lilies. Vale stopped her with a glance at her shaking hands. "Leave that!" "It was my work. It is ruined." She looked at the white heads, bent under sleet, and let the basket go. There would be no saving those flowers now, and no honour in pretending otherwise. She gathered the edges of her soaked sleeves instead, drew one breath deep enough to ache, and stepped toward the waiting carriage lamp, while Duke Vale carried his son through the gate, and did not once set him down. The carriage lantern swung in the wind and threw a wavering circle over wet stone as Helena reached it, her skirts heavy with sleet, her hands so cold she could not feel the seams in her own cuffs. Behind her, the Duke crossed the yard with Thomas still held against his chest, one arm under the boy's knees, the other bracing his back with unyielding care. He hadn't surrendered the child to a groom. He hadn't asked a servant to take over. Thomas's breathing had steadied into rough, tired pulls, each one audible in the narrow space beneath the lich gate. A coachman opened the door. Duke Vale did not hand the boy up at once. He looked to Helena first. "Inside," he said. She stared at the carriage interior, at the dry squabs and fur robe and polished brass fittings that announced rank as plainly as a title. "Your Grace, I'm soaked through." "Inside!" The command carried no temper. It carried decision. She climbed in because argument would have wasted the boy's breath and her own strength. The cushions gave beneath her with indecent softness. Mud dripped from her hem to the floor mat. Thomas stirred when the Duke passed him into her arms. Even half asleep and shivering, he turned his face toward her shoulder by instinct, one hand catching at her sleeve. Vale stepped in after them and shut the door himself. Rain beat the roof in hard, close bursts. Through the glass, she saw Mrs. Harbury standing motionless by the yews, silk darkening at the edges, as if she had not yet understood that the axis had shifted and left her off balance. The Duke tapped the roof once. The carriage lurched into motion. Thomas coughed against Helena's collarbone. She adjusted him and began counting under her breath without thinking, the same measured rhythm she had used at the trough, 1 in, 2 out. The boy followed, exhausted but obedient. Vale sat opposite, knees braced, gloved hands flat on his thighs. His gaze moved between Thomas's face and Helena's fingers at the child's back. It did not move anywhere else. "You are shaking," he said. "Cold passes." It does not pass quickly when skin is wet. She gave the answer habit had trained into her. I am accustomed to it. His jaw tightened at that, a brief hard line under the scar at his temple. I have noticed. The words landed with more force than raised voices in the church. She looked up, despite herself. He held her gaze for one breath, then reached to the side bench, took the folded wool travelling blanket, and handed it across. Wrap him first, he said, then yourself. She obeyed in that order. Thomas disappeared beneath dark wool and sighed once, the sound almost painful in its relief. Helena drew the remaining fold around her own shoulders and felt heat begin to return in sharp pins along her forearms. It hurt. She welcomed it. By the time the church bells fell silent behind them, the carriage had turned from the broad street onto the narrower lane toward Harbury House, wheels grinding over slush and broken ice. The city looked blurred at the edges through sleeted glass. Shop shutters rattled. Chimneys smoked low. A woman carrying loaves paused to watch the Duke's crest pass, and then looked quickly away when she glimpsed Helena inside. Thomas shifted and opened his eyes. Papa, I am here. Do not send her away. Vale did not answer at once. He watched Helena's hand where it rested over the blanket at Thomas's chest, counting each rise and fall. Then he said, She is coming with us. The boy's fingers loosened. He slept again. Helena kept her eyes on the child because looking at the Duke while he made promises in that tone felt like stepping onto uncertain ice. Your Grace, when I retrieve my father's box, I may be delayed. Mrs. Harbury keeps keys on her person when she is afraid. Then you will not search alone. You gave orders for the grooms to wait at the door. I revise them now. His voice remained level. I will stand in the hall. She turned her head. Your son needs the physician. He has his draft in the leather case beneath the forward seat. The fit has broken. He is safer breathing in this carriage than he was in that churchyard. We have 20 minutes, Miss Murphy. Use them. There was no vanity in his statement, no drama, only triage, chosen and reprioritized in real time. She felt a complicated, unwelcome surge in her throat and pressed it down. Harbury House rose out of the sleet with its front lamps lit and its shutters half closed against the weather, stone steps slick, brass knocker polished to a shine she had paid for with raw fingers. A maid opened the door at once when she saw the crest on the carriage, and then froze at the sight of Helena descending beside it, with the Duke behind her, and Thomas wrapped in wool against his shoulder. Where is Mrs. Davies? Helena asked. In the back passage, miss. The maid's eyes flicked to Vale and widened. Your Grace! Fetch Mrs. Davies, he said, and bring a coal scuttle to this hall, now. Servants moved. Fear was quicker than courtesy. Helena crossed the threshold she had scrubbed and swept and entered as if in borrowed skin, wet skirts trailing blanket around her shoulders like a claim she had not earned. The familiar smells struck at once. Beeswax, starch, old smoke, lavender from Mrs. Harbury's linen press. Above them, on the landing, a floorboard creaked. Someone was listening. Mrs. Davies appeared from the side passage with flour on her cuff and alarm in her face, then stopped when she saw Helena and the Duke together. Her knowing eyes took in everything in a single sweep. Thomas breathing, Helena drenched, the Duke still as iron. Miss Helena, she whispered. I need the back cupboard key, Helena said. The one from Father's study. Do you know where she put it? Mrs. Davies hesitated only a heartbeat. In the blue jar behind the warming shelf this morning. I saw her hide it when the messenger came. Helena nodded once and turned toward the service corridor. Vale shifted Thomas in his arms and spoke without raising his voice. Miss Murphy, She stopped. "You will remain in rooms with open doors." Yet protection again, wearing the shape of command. She inclined her head. "Yes, Your Grace." The service passage was dim and close, stone underfoot, colder than the hall. Helena moved quickly past the scullery, past the pantry she had never been permitted to open without permission, into the old study that had been stripped of books and renamed the accounts room to erase memory. The grate was unlit. The desk was gone. Only the wall cupboard remained in the corner, its lock unchanged, brass gone dull with disuse. She reached behind the warming shelf in the adjoining closet and found the blue jar exactly where Mrs. Davies said. Her fingers closed on 2 keys and a short chain. She almost laughed from pure relief. The first key failed. The second turned with a dry, reluctant click. Inside sat one cedar box tied with faded cord, a stack of old ledgers, and a leather dispatch case she had never seen. Dust lay thick over all 3. She lifted the cedar box first. It was heavier than she remembered. Her father's initials, E.M., were scratched inside the lid edge where only a person holding it would ever see. Her vision blurred for one instant and cleared again. Footsteps struck the corridor. Swift, angry. Mrs. Harbury appeared in the doorway in wet silk and crushed composure, hat askew, rosewater sharp enough to sting. "Put that down!" Helena straightened with the box held to her ribs. "You have no right to break locks in my house," Mrs. Harbury said, voice rising. "You thieving, ungrateful girl, give it here." "It was my father's." "It was my husband's estate, and his debts consumed it. You consumed it. Do you know what your keep has cost?" She advanced 2 steps, gloved hand outstretched. "Hand it to me." Helena did not retreat. The open door at her back mattered. The Duke's order held in her ears like a rail. "Where is my letter from Mr. Pike?" she asked. Mrs. Harbury's expression flickered, then hardened. "Destroyed, as all malicious nonsense will be." A shadow fell across the threshold behind Mrs. Harbury. Duke Vale filled the doorway, Thomas still in his arms, the boy now awake and watching with solemn, overlarge eyes. Vale's coat dripped onto the boards. He looked from the open cupboard to the keys in Helena's hand, to the cedar box against her chest, to Mrs. Harbury's outstretched glove. "Step away from her," he said. Mrs. Harbury spun, fury and panic crossing her face too quickly to mask. "Your Grace, she has forced entry and stolen private papers." Vale did not look at her. He looked at Helena. "Is that your father's box?" "Yes." "Then it is not stolen." Mrs. Harbury laughed once, brittle and high. "You cannot adjudicate property by sentiment in a corridor." "I am not adjudicating," he said. "I am observing." He shifted Thomas carefully to his left arm and held out his right hand toward Mrs. Harbury, palm up, as if requesting a calling card. "The letter." "I do not have it." "Liar." The single word was quiet. It cut cleaner than a shout. Mrs. Harbury's chin lifted. "You insult me in my own house." "Your house." His gaze flicked to the stripped shelves, the cold grate, the open lock. "Interesting claim." She drew herself up, silk rustling like warning wings. "I will not be searched." "Then empty your reticule yourself." For a moment she seemed likely to refuse. Then Thomas coughed, a small ragged sound in the close room, and Vale's eyes moved to his son with an instinctive severity that said time had run thin. He spoke again, slower. "Do not mistake restraint for uncertainty, Mrs. Harbury." Her fingers trembled once at the clasp. She snapped it open and tipped the contents onto the desk that had replaced her father's writing table. Vinaigrette, lace handkerchief, coin purse, church fan, and one damp, folded letter sealed with dark wax, split at the edge but unbroken across the centre. Pike's fish and quills stared up from the blotter. Helena set the cedar box down long enough to pick up the letter. She expected it to feel light. It felt like iron. Vale's gaze remained on Mrs. Harbury. You took correspondence addressed to Miss Murphy in a church before witnesses. It was for her protection. It was for your control. The truth of it sat in the room like cold water. Mrs. Harbury flushed, then paled. You overreach, Your Grace. No. He shifted Thomas once more, and this time his voice changed, the clipped authority edged by something older and less forgivable. I have watched that girl stand behind her sister for years, while you renamed deprivation as discipline. I have watched you spend her father's respectability and call her gratitude the debt. You mistake public silence for lack of witnesses. Helena could not move. The letter in her hand shook against the paper grain. He had watched, not imagined, not inferred, watched. Mrs. Harbury stared as if struck. If you had objections, you should have spoken to me privately. I am speaking now. Thomas turned his face toward Helena from his father's shoulder and reached one hand toward her without looking away from the adults, the gesture small and absolute. She touched his fingers with her free hand. He settled. Vale looked at the cedar box, then at the leather dispatch case still in the cupboard. Take both, Helena hesitated. The ledgers. Take what matters. We are done in this room. She gathered the dispatch case by its handle, then the cedar box against her side, tucking Pike's letter into the inner seam of her bodice, where no one else's hand would reach. Her arms ached. She did not loosen her hold. In the hall, a coal scuttle had been set beside the hearth and lit. Orange light moved over wet boots and dark wool. Mrs. Davies stood near the stair with two housemaids behind her, all three silent, all three watching as Helena emerged carrying her father's papers in plain sight. No one called her thief. No one told her to put them back. Mrs. Harbury followed, breath quick, voice sharp, with the first true fracture Helena had heard in years. You cannot take her from this house on a whim. Vale stopped at the threshold and turned half toward her, Thomas's weight steady in his arms, rain and hearthlight marking one side of his face in silver and the other in shadow. It is not a whim, he said. It is a boundary. He looked at Helena then, directly, with that same exactness that made evasion useless. You do not return here without legal escort, he said. Not for clothes, not for orders, not for apologies. The words were command, protection, and verdict at once. Helena stood in the doorway with sleet still tapping the panes behind her, cedar box against her ribs, letter warm over her heart, and understood that one sentence had altered the map of her life more cleanly than any plea she had ever made. She inclined her head, not in submission, but in recognition. Yes, Your Grace. He held her gaze one moment longer, then turned and led her into the sleet, Thomas rapped against his chest, while she followed with the cedar box and dispatch case gripped so tightly her split fingers reopened under the handles. By the time the carriage lamps climbed the rise to Ravenscar, night had settled over the stone facade and every upper window burned with disciplined light. A physician waited under the portico with a leather bag already open. Vale handed Thomas down first. "Lungs," he said. "Now!" The doctor bowed and took the child inside at once, Mrs. Davies at his shoulder. Helena did not move until she heard Thomas cough, breathe, and call once for her from the corridor. Vale faced the butler. "Summon Mr. Pike, Mr. Westcott, the estate steward, and the parish rector from St. Cyprian's. Send for the magistrate on duty. Tell him I require formal record tonight." He looked to Helena. "Can you read now?" Yes. Then you will read before witnesses. The drawing-room at Ravenscar held heat enough to sting her skin after the storm. Her wet sleeves had been replaced by plain dry wool borrowed from the house linen press, but her wrists still showed bruises in candlelight, distinct as fingerprints pressed in ink. The cedar box sat on the table beside the dispatch case, Pike's damp letter beside both, and Helena's hidden shorthand notebook now lay open where she had slid it from the mantel seam with careful hands. She had never shown it to anyone after her father died. Vale saw it and said nothing, though his eyes sharpened with recognition. 3/4 of an hour after their arrival, men filed into the room in boots crusted with sleet. Mr. Pike came first, older, stooped and breathing hard, his office seal ring still on his hand. Mr. Westcott followed, hat clutched flat against his chest. The rector stood rigid near the hearth. The magistrate entered last with 2 officers and a leather folio, nodded to the Duke, and took his place at the writing desk. Mrs. Harbury was brought in by a footman, silk changed, pearls reset, composure restored by force. Clara came behind her in wedding satin under a travelling cloak, Lord Ashcombe beside her, with his palms stitched and bound in clean linen. No one spoke until Vale did. Miss Murphy will present evidence. You will listen. Helena broke Pike's seal. The letter crackled as it opened, still damp, at one edge from churchyard rain. She read aloud, voice low at first, then steadying. Pike had audited old Murphy ledgers after receiving an unsigned inquiry. He had found debt transfers entered in a second hand, post-dated to the week after Edward Murphy's burial. He had enclosed references to a codicil witnessed but never filed in probate. He urged immediate review before destruction of private papers. When she finished, Pike stepped forward, produced his clerk's copybook, and placed it beside the letter. I wrote every line, he said, and I sent a courier because I believed documents were in danger. Mrs. Harbury gave a controlled laugh. A clerk's suspicions are not law. No, said the magistrate, dipping his pen, but they begin it. Helena untied the faded cord on her father's cedar box. Inside lay folded deeds, 3 small ledgers, and a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands shook once as she opened the packet. The codicil rested on top, her father's signature clear despite the final tremor in the downstroke, 2 witness names beneath, and a clause she had imagined 100 nights yet never dared trust was real. At Helena Murphy's majority, the Bath townhouse proceeds and surviving legal library were to be divided in equal beneficial share between both daughters, with no transfer of one share to marital guardians without written consent of the named daughter. She read that clause aloud. Silence followed so complete the coals could be heard collapsing in the grate. Mrs. Harbury recovered first. Forgery. My husband was fevered. He signed anything put before him. Pike spoke without heat. He dictated this to me in full command. Mr. Fenley and Reverend Sloane witnessed. Their marks are there. The rector of St. Cyprian's leaned closer, then lifted his head, face draining. Sloane was my predecessor. This is his hand. Helena opened the first ledger from the box. Her father's shorthand filled the margins, exact and compact. She laid her own notebook beside it and began translating line by line, symbol into plain English, then plain English against the estate accounts seized from Harbury House. Borrowed sums had been moved from joint estate liability to Helena's personal column without consent. Maintenance charges had been inflated and duplicated. Clara's dowry disbursements had been concealed under generic household headings to evade scrutiny. In the dispatch case, 2 debt assignments bore altered dates. Pike identified the scraped parchment under fresh ink. Mr. Westcott, when pressed by the magistrate, admitted he had been asked to copy figures for household efficiency and had seen one page replaced after signing. Mrs. Harbury's chin lifted with brittle pride. "I preserved that family from ruin." "You consumed one daughter to preserve your authority over the other," Vale said. Clara made a strangled sound and looked from the pages to her mother, then to Helena. "I did not know," she whispered. The words were small but unfeigned. Mrs. Harbury turned on her at once. "Do not be weak." Helena looked at Clara's white face, at the blood-stained ribbon still tied around Ashcombe's wrist from the altar wound, now drying brown at the edge where linen met skin. That ribbon had been hers before it became his bandage. A strange emblem of the day. She could have asked the magistrate to freeze every Harbury asset, including the dowry settled on Clara that morning. She could have made ruin symmetrical. Instead, she faced the magistrate. "Record this precisely. I petition recovery of my legal share, restoration of my father's library and instruments, and criminal review of fraudulent transfers. I do not petition seizure of the dowry settled on Lady Ashcombe today. It was contracted and witnessed at the altar. Let it stand." Ashcombe looked at her as if he had not understood her until that line. Clara lowered her head, tears standing but unshed. Vale did not move. He had stood near the mantel since the reading began, one hand resting on the carved stone, as still as if any movement would fracture what he had heard. When Helena finished, he stepped forward into the centre of the room and addressed Mrs. Harbury before steward, magistrate, rector, clerk, and new bride alike. "Mrs. Harbury, you will leave this house by sunset. Miss Murphy remains under my protection." He paused, and the pause held old anger and new restraint in equal measure. His next words were lower. "Do not apologise for surviving what was done to you." The magistrate rose. "On the evidence presented, I am issuing provisional seizure of disputed account books and ordering Mrs. Harbury to answer charges of fraud and coercive misappropriation. Officers." The two men moved to either side of Mrs. Harbury. She did not struggle. Silk rustled when she straightened. The same dry whisper that had once announced her power in every room Helena entered. Now it sounded thin. "You would shame me before servants," she said to Vale. "I would stop you before more harm," he answered. Near midnight the house had gone quieter by degrees. Thomas slept upstairs after his draught, breathing evenly at last. One small hand curled around the wooden horse Mrs. Davies said he had carried since infancy. The seized ledgers were locked in the steward's iron chest with the magistrate's seal. Pike's letter, the codicil, Helena's notebook, and her father's dispatch case were copied and receipted before witnesses, then placed in a new deed box under Helena's name. Even the ruined wedding lilies were accounted for. A groom had found the basket in the churchyard mud and brought it with the carriage. Helena asked that the broken stems be laid at the chapel graves where her father's old clerks rested, and Mrs. Davies carried them herself before dawn. In the entry hall, while the officers escorted Mrs. Harbury toward the waiting carriage, Helena stepped out from the stair shadow. The lamps cast gold along the black and white floor. Rain had stopped. Only dripping eaves remained. "Your Grace," she said quietly. Vale turned. "Why did you see me when no one else did?" For several breaths he gave no answer. His gaze went past her shoulder to the dark window, then back to her bruised wrist, then to her face. At last he said, "Because I knew the shape of being used and called ungrateful for enduring it." He glanced toward the stairs where Thomas slept. "And because my son breathed easier when you were near?" Behind them, the officers guided Mrs. Harbury through the door. Her silk gave one last rustle against the jamb and was gone into the wet night. On the first clear morning of April, Sunlight reached the long table in the restored Murphy Library at Ravenscar's Bath townhouse, warming the leather spines that had been returned crate by crate under court order. Helena stood on a step-stool in plain blue muslin, reshelving her father's annotated volumes while Thomas recited Latin declensions at the window and groaned at each correction she gave. Clara and Lord Ashcombe arrived just after 11 in a modest carriage with no Harbury crest. Clara wore no wedding pearls. She asked, in a voice stripped of old brightness, whether she might see Helena privately. They stood between the law reports and the atlas chest. Clara removed one glove, then the other, hands unsteady. "I believed what was easiest to believe," she said. "That comfort meant innocence. I was wrong." She set a small key on the table. "This was in my mother's jewel case. It fits the last drawer of father's escritoire. I think she kept it from you." Helena took the key. Clara looked directly at her for the first time in years. "I will not ask forgiveness as if it were owed. I only wish to leave truth where I can." She bowed her head once and returned to her husband, who waited at the threshold with sober courtesy. They departed without spectacle. That evening Thomas insisted Helena hear him read from Gulliver before supper, and stumbled through 3 pages without an asthma break, then announced to his father with solemn triumph, "Miss Murphy is strict but fair. I choose her forever." Vale's mouth shifted, not quite a smile. "A formidable appointment," he said. By the 2nd week of June, the Court of Chancery order was entered. Helena Murphy recognised co-heiress under codicil, fraudulent transfers voided, personal liabilities struck from her name, management rights secured in trust to her sole signature upon marriage, unless she chose otherwise by separate instrument. She signed each page with a hand that no longer shook. That same afternoon, in her father's restored library, Vale came in without ceremony, set his gloves on the desk, and stood opposite her with the windows open to summer rain. "I will not offer rescue," he said. "You no longer require it." "No. I offer marriage, with settlement drafted to your terms, property retained in your name, and Thomas's education remaining under your direction, if you consent." She looked at the shelves, at the codicil framed above the mantel, at the desk where her father had once taught her that precision was kindness. Then she looked at the man who had first spoken to her in commands, and had learned slowly to place care inside them, without concealment. "I consent," she said, "on those terms." He exhaled as if releasing a held line from battle. "Then we proceed lawfully." They did. Their marriage licence was signed in daylight, witnessed by Pike, Mrs. Davies, and a magistrate who checked every clause twice. Helena entered the chapel, not behind Clara, not as furniture and not with empty hands, but with her own name, her own property, and the steady boy she tutored walking proudly at her side.